In the previous episode, we've seen how we can take an array and filter it out based on a condition. Today we will be talking about something slightly similar, which is taking an array and instead of filtering it out, we will take each item, each element of that array, and we will transform it, which means that we will apply a function, the same function, to each element of that array. And the result will be another array where each element will be transformed. And we call this operation a transformation. So this operation is called mapping elements. And we use a function called map. This function is universal in programming, and it's available in most of the programming languages. To get a deep understanding into this function, we will try to first implement it on our own, and then we will see what JavaScript gives us out of the box, and we'll compare the advantages and disadvantages. Filtering is the process of reducing a given array to a shorter array, because we want to filter out certain elements based on the condition we are providing. By analogy or by contrast, mapping is transforming an array with a certain number of elements to another array with the same number of elements, where each element is transformed by a function. The output of filtering is usually shorter than the input, because we are filtering, and the output of the map function, produces an array of the same length, of the same size, with the difference that the elements are transformed. We could define mapping as a process of transforming the input array by applying a given function to each element of that array and producing a new array of the same size, where each element is a result of applying this function to each element of the input array. So let's imagine we have a function, add1, which takes a value, an input, a number, and adds 1. So if we give it 1, it produces 2. If we give it 10, it produces 11. If we give it 100, it produces 101, and so forth. What mapping does is that if we give an array 1, 2, 3, 4, we expect an array 2, 3, 4, 5 when we apply this function add1 to each element, which means that it transforms this array by applying the function add1 to 1, because this is the first element, applying the function add1 to 2, applying the function add1 to 3, and applying the function add1 to 4. And once it's evaluated, it will produce 2, because add1 on 1 is 2, add1 on 2 is 3, 4, and 5. So let's quickly test it, and let's define an array called numbers. And let's say it's 1, 2, 3, and let's say 44, just so that it's not. And as I said, map, similarly to filter, is defined already in JavaScript on the array object as a method. So we can just say numbers.map, and we can provide the function we want to apply, which is this function over here. And let's assign it to a result, and let's print. So as a result, we should have an array consisting of 4 elements, because that's the size of the input array, with the numbers 2, 3, 4, and 45. Let's see. 2, 3, 4, 45. So it works. So now let's try to do it on our own. Let's try to build this function by hand. So it's very similar to filtering. So let's define our input array, and let's say for a change, this will be 4 elements like so. And now it's almost identical to what we did with filtering. So we need to first of all take care of the result. So we need to have an array that will be constructed once we iterate over the our input, which is numbers. Now we have to iterate, so we have to keep track of the current element, so we have to do it manually. So we have to do the declaration of an item, of an element, of numbers. And now, previously we had a condition here. We had a statement that applying a predicate to current element and deciding if this element should be added to the result or not, to the output of that operation, of that process. And here we won't have the condition because we just mapping, so we will always add result, we will be always pushing. But instead of adding just the element, we will be adding a function which we haven't defined yet, that's invoked on that current element. Let's define this function quickly. So we can say that this function takes an element and let's say it adds 2. So now if we print the result, we are getting the array we are expecting. So as you can see, it's even simpler than filtering, because what we do is that we apply a function to the current element that's from the array we are iterating over, and then we are just pushing this to our result, which we defined over here. So what's the problem with this approach? So it's similar to what we did with filtering. The first problem is that we have to keep track of the current element, so we need a variable, which we define here with let. So this, in our case, is called element. We need to define the place where we will be storing the result. So that's the second thing we have to take care of. And thirdly, we have to iterate over this array on our own, we could say. So instead of doing that, as we did at the beginning, we could just take the numbers, use the built-in map function, which is defined as a method on the array object, and just pass the function which we define over here. So let's define this as error. Let's remove that. And for our change, let's do 3 here. And it works as well. So as you can see, as you can compare, this line is much simpler than all that stuff we did here. So it's just more straightforward. All the details are hidden from us. But the funny thing is, that's not the only way of defining the map function and the filter function. We are defining this process in imperative way. But in functional programming, it's also possible to do it in a more elegant, let's say, or in a more interesting way using the recursion. So I plan to talk about it in the future episodes. For now, let's leave it like that. And let's focus now on how we can use this function. Before we go any further, let's do a quick note. So the note is as follows. Loops introduce complexity. It's small complexity, it's tiny complexity, but still it's a complexity, so it adds something to our mental process, and to when we share this code with other people, it's slightly longer, there is more elements we have to take care of, and on top of that, there's also the fact that in JavaScript you have many ways of doing the iteration. So in this case we use the for of loop, but there are other types of looping. So in depends, you can choose different ways and you can achieve the same result with each of those methods. So if you are using the map, the built-in map function, you don't have to care about that. It's hidden from you and it's easier to understand by others. So now let's see how we can use the map function in different scenarios. So far we have been talking about numbers, but map can be also used to transform objects. And it works kind of similar to what we did in filtering. So let's try to transform an array of objects. So I will grab the array we had, and let's say we want to transform this array so that instead of having the year of birth of a given person, let's transform it so that we have a name and a current age in 2019. So let's start by defining our function, and it will be, let's call it born to age. And this function will take an element, the current element, and let's keep it simple. So we need to return the whole object, which means that we need to keep the name. So we are reassigning the name from the current element to our new object we are creating here. And instead of using the born field, we will create a new field, age. And here we will subtract the born coming from the current element from the 2019, so we have the age. So this function, we can simplify it, we can make it shorter, but I don't want to overcomplicate this right now. Let's just see if it works. So let me take the people array and let's apply born to age. Let's assign it to a variable and let's print it. It seems to work. So as I said, this function can be simplified. So what we can do first is that we can do an implicit return, but it's slightly more complicated in the case when we are returning an object here. So what we need to, because as you can see now we have two curly braces. So in JavaScript you have instead used the normal parentheses so that it works. So let's test it. It still works. And now we can even go further, and instead of doing it like that, we can do destructuring. So we can say that we are taking the name and born from the input, and we will assign name to name. So we can further reduce to name, and here we don't have to use the element, and it still works. But this is like a optional. I will dive into that in the future episodes. So it's as simple as that. So now we gained some insight into how it works, or how we can do it on our own. So let's try to define it. So JavaScript map. So JavaScript map is a higher order function, again, because it takes the function as a parameter. This function is defined as a method on the array object in JavaScript, and which means it's built in, you can use it, you don't have to create it from scratch as we did here. And it applies this a function which is provided as a parameter to each element of the calling array. So if you are invoking this map on an array, it takes it from the left side, the array, each element of the array from the left side, and applies the function and produces a new array where each element is a result of applying this function to each element. That's all for today. See you next time.